There is a name that keeps reappearing in the genealogical records of the upper Midwest, in the old Lutheran church registers of Minnesota and Wisconsin and the Dakotas, and it does not belong where the census says it should. The family called themselves German. They listed themselves as German in 1880, in 1890, in 1900. The men farmed, the women kept their maiden names inside the family Bible, and passed them to daughters who eventually stopped writing them down at all. But the name, the original name before it was compressed into something a county clerk in Nebraska could spell without thinking about it, was not German. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The shape of it, the prefix structure, the root syllable, pointed somewhere older and considerably farther north. Pointed, if you trace the surname distribution maps, toward the coastlines of Norway and Denmark, and the river valleys the Norse had pushed into 1,000 years before anyone in that family had ever heard of Nebraska. And when the great-grandchildren of that family submitted their DNA samples a century later, the result came back with a percentage of Scandinavian ancestry sitting in the genome at levels that the German paper trail could not explain. Not a trace, not an artifact of testing error, a line. A sustained inheritance running back through the official record and then past it, into a chapter of the family's history that the census never recorded because the family had stopped acknowledging it before the census takers arrived. This is the pattern the DNA studies document when you read the genome against the genealogical paper trail for families with these characteristics. A percentage of Scandinavian ancestry appearing in the autosomal results at levels that imply a real ancestral contributor, not a distant coincidence, sitting in a family whose documented lineage runs entirely through German or English or Scots-Irish lines, with no recorded Scandinavian connection anywhere. The genome is saying something the census never wrote down. A bloodline ran through these families under names that changed and identities that shifted, century after century, until the original Norse stock was buried so deep in the official record that only the genome still preserved the signal clearly enough to read. The 7 signs that a family might carry Viking blood are not stories passed down around a fire. They are patterns. Patterns in the DNA studies, in the surname migration records, in the census anomalies, in the haplogroup frequencies that appear in populations with no official Scandinavian ancestry on paper, but with the genetic markers of the Norse expansion written clearly into the genome. Each sign points toward the same possibility, that the official genealogical record, the one your family has been telling itself for 5 or 6 generations, may be missing a chapter that began on the coast of Scandinavia and ended in the American interior without ever being written down as what it was. The first sign is a surname that bends wrong. Surnames derived from Old Norse naming conventions carry a specific structure that survives anglicization in recognizable form, if you know what the original looked like. The suffix patterns built around the Norse root for son of, or the prefix structures that incorporate Old Norse words for bay, valley, island, river, or settlement, appear in anglicized American records in forms that a genealogist trained in Scandinavian naming history can still identify even after 3 or 4 generations of spelling drift. A name like Thorson becomes Thurston, becomes Thurson, and eventually, in certain Midwestern county records of the 1870s, collapses into something that reads as entirely English on the surface, while the underlying root is still legible if you press it. Names ending in the anglicized forms of son, Vic, Dahl, Holm, or Berg, especially in families who claim German or Dutch or Scottish origin in the late 19th century census, deserve a second examination. The distribution maps for these surnames in American records show concentrations not only in the areas of documented Scandinavian settlement, the known Norwegian communities of Minnesota, or the Swedish enclaves of Illinois, but in counties where no Scandinavian migration is officially recorded at all. Families who came through the mid-Atlantic ports in the 1700s, who followed the wagon roads south and west, who settled in communities that called themselves Scots-Irish or Pennsylvania German, and yet the name they carried, traced back far enough through the spelling variants, came from somewhere the family's own account of itself had stopped going. The second sign is haplogroup I1. This is the Y chromosome marker most consistently associated with ancient Norse and Germanic populations. And when DNA testing companies began returning results to American families in the early 2000s, certain family clusters began producing I1 results at rates that the claimed ancestry on paper could not account for. The haplogroup I1 is passed from father to son in the same way a surname is, unchanged across generations except for the occasional small mutation that allows geneticists to date branches and trace migration corridors. It appears at its highest global frequencies in Scandinavia, with Sweden showing the highest concentration, followed by Norway, Denmark, and the coastal regions of northern Germany that experienced centuries of Norse settlement and Norse cultural influence. When a family from eastern Kentucky or the Tennessee Hill Country or the farm counties of the Ohio Valley produces I1 at the Y chromosome level, and that family's paper trail runs back through Virginia or the Carolinas with no recorded Scandinavian ancestor anywhere in the documented line, the haplogroup itself is the evidence. The genome is carrying a male line that the census record lost. Somewhere in that family's patrilineal history, there was a man whose Y chromosome came from Norse stock, and the paper trail between that man and his American descendants simply stopped recording the ancestry honestly at some point along the way. The third sign is a physical trait cluster that recurs across generations without a documented explanation in the family's genealogy. Population genetics documents that certain trait combinations appear at higher frequencies in populations with strong Norse heritage, and when these combinations persist across multiple generations in a family whose paper record shows no pathway for Scandinavian ancestry, and when a DNA test then returns Scandinavian percentages in the 15 to 30% range, the traits in the genome are pointing at the same ancestor. The persistence of reddish or auburn undertones in hair that the family otherwise classifies as brown or dark blonde, appearing in children who have no parent with red hair and no grandparent either, but whose great-great-grandmother in the old photographs had a quality of coloring that the family always noted as different, is one such signal. Facial bone structure that recurs in a family across generations, and that physical anthropologists have documented as characteristic of skeletal remains recovered from Norse settlement sites in Iceland and the British Isles, is another. No single physical characteristic confirms ancestry. But physical traits in combination with haplogroup evidence and surname structure and anomalous DNA percentages form a convergent case, and convergent cases are what genealogists are trained to read. The fourth sign is a migration pattern that runs counter to the claimed ancestry. Most German immigrant families in 19th century America followed well-documented pathways. They came through Baltimore and Philadelphia and New York. They settled in specific geographic corridors historians have traced with precision. They formed church communities, maintained German language institutions, and left paper records in German as well as English for several generations. But certain families who claim German origin in the late 19th century census do not fit this pattern when you look at where they actually were and when they were there. They arrived earlier than the main German migration waves of the 1840s and 1850s. They came through different ports, or through no port record at all. They settled in areas that had been reached not by the German migration routes, but by the older Scots-Irish and English pathways of the colonial period, in counties where the nearest German-speaking congregation was 30 or 40 miles away, and the family attended an English-language church instead. When a family's migration pattern and settlement geography do not match the origin they claimed, when the record of where they were contradicts the story of where they came from, the movement itself becomes a sign. The family was already in the American interior under a different identity before the wave they later claimed to belong to had even reached these shores. The fifth sign is the persistence of Norse naming conventions across generations that should, by any logic of cultural assimilation, have erased them. Families who maintained the practice of cycling through a tight pool of given names that had Norse roots, returning generation after generation to forms of names like Gunnar and Eric and Sigrid and Astrid and Halvard in family Bibles that otherwise read as entirely English or German in their other contents, were preserving something without necessarily understanding what they were preserving or where it came from. Naming conventions are among the most conservative of all cultural inheritances. They survive long after the language and the explicit cultural identity have been lost because they are transmitted not as ideology, but as sentiment, as the weight of a grandmother's preference, as the insistence of an elderly patriarch who could not explain why the name mattered, but was certain that it did. A name that keeps reappearing in a family's records across 4 or 5 American generations, that has no parallel in the English or German naming pool the family otherwise drew from, may be the last audible signal of an origin story that the family stopped telling out loud several generations before anyone now living was born. So if you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The sixth sign is an autosomal DNA result with Scandinavian percentages that no documented ancestor can account for. This is where the evidence becomes, for many families, the most difficult to reconcile with the story they have been maintaining. Autosomal DNA tests measure ancestry across all lines, not just the paternal Y chromosome or the maternal mitochondrial line, and they average the genetic contributions of every ancestor across roughly 5 to 7 generations, with the contributions of more recent ancestors weighted more heavily than those farther back. A result showing 12% Scandinavian ancestry, or 18%, or 22%, in a family whose documented genealogy contains no Scandinavian ancestor within the range the test is reading, is not a testing artifact. The major commercial DNA companies have refined their Scandinavian reference populations across successive generations of their testing platforms, and a persistent Scandinavian signal at those percentage levels consistently implies a real ancestral contributor, a man or woman with genuine Norse or Scandinavian heritage, sitting somewhere in the 4 or 5 generation window the autosomal test is most sensitive to. When that person does not appear in the paper record, the gap between the genome and the genealogy is the document. The census did not record this ancestor accurately. The family stopped speaking about this line. Or the original identity was changed, voluntarily or under the pressure of social circumstances, at some point in the American record, and the change was thorough enough that every paper document afterward reflected the new identity, while the genome went on carrying the old one. The seventh sign is present in the property records, the farm names, and the local oral traditions that certain families maintained in communities with no official Scandinavian settlement history. The Norse practice of identifying families by the farm they came from, and the habit of naming properties with words drawn from Old Norse descriptions of landscape and geography, left residual traces in the American record in places that surprised researchers when the DNA evidence brought them back to look. A farm called something that translates from Old Norse, a deed recorded in a Virginia or Ohio county court that preserves a property name with a recognizable Norse root, a family that referred to the old homestead by a name no one in the current generation could explain, but that everyone agreed had always been what it was called. These residual names survived in isolated communities across the Appalachian Ridge and the river valleys of the upper Midwest, because the families using them kept using them long after they stopped remembering what the names meant or where they originated. When the DNA returns a Scandinavian percentage and the property records contain a place name with a Norse etymology, the connection between them is not speculation. It is evidence converging from two different directions onto the same buried layer of the family's history. The mechanism by which Norse ancestry disappeared from the American genealogical record is not a single event or a single decision. It is a sequence of layered erasures, each one building on the previous, each one leaving the actual bloodline one step further from the surface of the official record. The Norse expansion of the 9th through the 11th centuries pushed Scandinavian populations into the British Isles in waves that the DNA record of Britain and Ireland still documents clearly. The Danelaw, the Norse settlements of northern and eastern England, established by Danish and Norwegian raiding and colonizing forces in the 9th century, left genetic signatures in the English population that persisted across the Norman conquest and through the following centuries of English national consolidation. The Norse colonies in Orkney and Shetland and along the Scottish coastline, and the Hiberno-Norse communities of Dublin and the Irish sea coast, similarly contributed Norse genetic material to populations that subsequently identified as Scottish, Irish, and English rather than Scandinavian. By the time the colonial migration streams of the 17th and 18th centuries were forming in Britain, a significant portion of the population embarking for Virginia and Pennsylvania and the Carolinas was carrying Norse-derived genetic material under English and Scottish and Irish surnames in families that had not thought of themselves as Scandinavian for 5 or 6 centuries. The Norse ancestry was already buried under British identities before the Atlantic crossing. The American record inherited it that way. The additional pressures of the American colonial record compounded the burial. County clerks and church registrars wrote down what they heard and what they expected to hear, collapsing the phonetic complexity of Norse-derived root forms into whatever English approximation fit most easily on the page. A surname that had been Scandinavian in origin and then partially anglicized during several generations in the British Isles was anglicized a second time in the American colonial record, and the 2 rounds of phonetic compression together could produce a written form that bore only structural resemblance to the original Norse root. When you cannot read the name as Norse anymore, the origin it once signaled stops being visible. The linguistic cue that might have sustained some family memory of a Scandinavian thread disappeared inside the spelling, and the family lost access to the only part of the record that might have prompted someone to ask where the name actually came from. What the DNA studies of the past 2 decades have done is restore a method of reading back through those layers. The haplogroup does not anglicize. The autosomal percentages do not change their names at the county clerk's desk. When a family in rural Minnesota or coastal Maine or the hill country of Tennessee submits a DNA sample and receives a result showing Scandinavian ancestry at percentages their documented family tree cannot explain, that result is not an anomaly to be dismissed. It is the genome performing the function that the census record failed to perform, recording the actual origin instead of the presented one. And when that result appears alongside the other 6 signs, when the surname bends wrong and the haplogroup points north, and the migration pattern does not match the claimed origin, and the naming conventions preserve something old, and the property records contain a Norse-derived place name, the Convergent case is strong enough to constitute a genealogical finding rather than a family legend. The families who show the strongest signals in the current DNA databases tend to share certain features in their genealogical profiles. Their paper trails go cold in the early to mid-1700s, often in Virginia or Pennsylvania or the Piedmont of the Carolinas, without a clear documented point of immigration. The immigrant ancestor is referenced in later family records, but the ship manifest, the port of origin, and the country of birth are absent from the documentary record or contradictory across different documents. The Y chromosome haplogroup, when tested, falls in I1 or occasionally R1a, the haplogroup associated with Eastern Norse populations and the early medieval migrations that carried substantial Norse genetic material across the Baltic and into Central Europe. And the autosomal result returns Scandinavian percentages that cluster in ranges implying an ancestor 3, 4, or 5 generations removed from the person being tested, not a first-generation immigrant. Not a second-generation child of immigrants, an ancestor whose identity was already submerged in the American record by the time the country began keeping the kind of systematic census documentation that would have preserved it. The county historical societies that maintained the most complete early records of American settlement sometimes hold the key in their deed books and church membership rolls, in the records of communities organized around ethnic and religious affiliations precise enough to distinguish between different groups of Northern European settlers. When a family appears in these records claiming one affiliation, but living in a community settled by a different group, following patterns of land acquisition and social connection that match the behavior of a different population entirely, the social geography of their settlement is evidence. A family who claimed German Reformed background but whose children married consistently into families with Norse-derived surnames, who attended a Lutheran congregation whose other members came disproportionately from documented Scandinavian origin households, who named their farms using words that a German speaker of the period would not have chosen, left a trail in the community records that the DNA now confirms in the genome. The women in these families sometimes preserve the most complete record because the mitochondrial DNA line, the inheritance that passes from mother to every child regardless of sex, and then onward from daughters to their children, carries haplogroup designations as diagnostic as the Y chromosome line. Haplogroup 1, the maternal counterpart associated with Northern European and specifically Scandinavian populations, appears in the mitochondrial profiles of women from families showing the 7 signs at rates the claimed ancestry cannot explain. A woman whose paper genealogy traces entirely through English colonial lines, but whose mitochondrial haplogroup places her maternal ancestry in the Norse settlement zones of northern Britain or coastal Scandinavia, is carrying a record that predates the American paper trail by several centuries. She inherited it from a maternal ancestor who was closer to the Norse source than any document in any American courthouse has acknowledged. What survives of these bloodlines in the American record today is a combination of genetic signal, surname residue, and the oral tradition that persisted only because someone, usually a grandmother or an elderly great-uncle, kept saying something that the family around them treated as old country romanticizing rather than as actual family history. In several county historical compilations from the 1930s and 40s, certain Midwestern families are recorded as maintaining traditions about an ancestor described simply as coming from the Old North, with no country name attached to the phrase, remembered for coloring and height, and a temperament the family called Old Viking stock, in the same casual way other families said Old Country, without examining what the phrase contained. The description, preserved in enough detail in a few accounts to compare against the DNA evidence that the same family's descendants eventually produced, matched the migration patterns and characteristics associated with Norse-descended populations in Britain rather than with the German or English communities the paper record officially placed them within. The DNA did not create this history, it recovered it. The haplogroups were always there. The autosomal percentages were being passed down in every generation. The surnames, even in their most anglicized forms, still carried their root structure to anyone who knew how to read Norse-derived naming patterns in American records. What changed was the availability of a method precise enough to hold the genome against the genealogical record and read the distance between them. When that distance shows up across 7 distinct patterns simultaneously, when every sign in the set points in the same direction, the case for a hidden Norse bloodline is not a genealogical legend waiting to be disproven. It is the documented record, assembled from what the genome preserved when the paper trail lost its nerve and stopped recording what it saw. Your own DNA result is the first thread to pull. If the Scandinavian percentage in your autosomal test sits above 10, and your documented genealogy shows no Scandinavian ancestor within 5 generations, that gap is worth investigating. The Y chromosome test, for men in the direct male line, will tell you whether the haplogroup falls in the Norse-associated designations. The surname, read against its spelling variants across 200 years of American records, and then against the Old Norse lexicon, may show a root structure that Anglicization covered, but did not erase. The migration corridor your family followed into the American interior may match the pathways used by Norse-descended populations moving out of the British Isles, rather than the pathways used by the German or English or Scots-Irish communities the family claimed. Each of these is a thread. Pull them in the same direction and they tend to lead toward the same source. The man whose bloodline you may be carrying did not call himself a Viking. That word belonged to a moment centuries past by the time his descendants crossed the Atlantic. He thought of himself in terms of whatever county or kingdom held him at the time. But the genome he passed down contained the evidence of something older than any of those identities. A northern lineage that moved through Britain and Ireland and across the ocean and into the American interior under names the original ancestors would not have recognized, doing what genomes do when the records fail to tell the truth about them. Surviving anyway, waiting to be read. The question of how deep the Norse genetic contribution runs in the American population is one academic researchers have approached carefully, because the answer depends on which layer of the ancestry you measure and which population you use as your reference point. Studies examining Y chromosome haplogroup distribution in American men of documented British Isles ancestry have found I1 frequencies higher than the documented Scandinavian immigration to America would predict, if you assume that the only pathway for Norse haplogroups into the American gene pool was direct 19th century Scandinavian immigration. That assumption is wrong, and the researchers who have examined this most closely have said so explicitly. The Norse contribution to the British Isles population, accumulated over several centuries of the Viking Age and then carried forward in the genetic profiles of English, Scottish, and Irish families who crossed the Atlantic, is a confounding factor in any equation that tries to map Scandinavian American ancestry onto documented Scandinavian immigration alone. The Norse were in Britain long before the British came to America. Their genetic contribution traveled inside British identities, invisible to the genealogical record, visible only to the haplogroup. The autosomal evidence adds a second dimension. When researchers at major genealogical DNA companies have examined the reference population data underlying the Scandinavian ancestry estimates they return to customers, they have consistently found that the Scandinavian signal in people of broadly documented British Isles ancestry is not random noise. It clusters in family groups. It appears at similar percentages across cousins who test independently. It correlates with Y chromosome haplogroup I1 at rates above what chance would produce. These patterns are consistent with a shared ancestral contributor sitting somewhere in the family tree and contributing genetic material that has persisted across subsequent generations. The percentage dilutes with each generation, but it does not disappear. At 4 or 5 generations of removal, a Scandinavian ancestor contributing 50% of their genome would still show up as a Scandinavian signal in the 3 to 7% range in their descendants. At 3 generations of removal, the signal sits in the 10 to 15% range. The families showing Scandinavian results in the 15 to 25% range have a substantially Scandinavian ancestor sitting considerably closer in the family tree than the paper record has ever shown. The social circumstances that made it rational for Norse-descended families to present as something else in the American colonial period are not difficult to reconstruct. The communities into which the colonial-era settlers were moving were organized around ethnic and religious affiliations that carried real material consequences. Church membership determined access to burial grounds, credit networks, community support in times of hardship, and the marriage pools from which your children would select their partners. A family that could present as German Reformed or Scots-Irish Presbyterian gained access to the community infrastructure of those groups. A family that presented as Scandinavian Lutheran in a county with no Lutheran congregation and no other Scandinavian families gained nothing and lost the social integration that made survival on the colonial frontier considerably more likely. The incentive to flatten the identity into whatever the surrounding community recognized was structural, not individual. It was a rational adaptation, not a lie told by one dishonest person. The children and grandchildren of those families grew up inside the new identity. They attended the church their parents had joined. They married into the families their community offered. They named their children from the local naming pool, though some of them, as the fifth sign shows, kept one or two old names cycling through the family tree without understanding why those particular names felt non-negotiable. By the third generation, the original identity was a matter of fading oral tradition. By the fourth or fifth generation, it was a story some family members remembered and others had never heard. The paper record from that point forward reflected only the presented identity. The genome reflected both. This is what makes the DNA evidence for Norse ancestry in American families both compelling and genealogically productive. It does not simply confirm a story the family already knew. In most cases where it appears alongside the full constellation of the seven signs, it recovers a story the family had lost. A chapter of the family's actual history that went undocumented not because no one lived it, but because the people who lived it had material reasons to live it quietly, to let the Norse chapter close without a written record, and to carry the identity forward only in the places where the social world around them could not reach. In the haplogroup, in the autosomal percentages, in a surname that kept a root form the anglicization process could compress but never erase, in a naming convention a grandmother enforced without being able to explain why. In the property record that preserved a place name no one in that community would have chosen from the linguistic pool they officially claimed. The record is there, distributed across more kinds of evidence than any single document could contain, requiring more than one kind of reading to assemble. For families that carry the seven signs, the evidence points toward a conclusion the genealogical paper trail was never designed to deliver. That somewhere in the line of fathers and mothers that converges on you, there was a Norse chapter. A generation or a line that came from the north, that carried a Y chromosome or a mitochondrial signature or an autosomal profile that the Scandinavian peninsula and the Norse settlements of the British Isles would recognize as their own. That chapter did not end when the family's paper record stopped recording it. It continued in the genome, generation after generation, waiting for a method precise enough to read what the census had chosen not to see. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.